Now, earlier on, before we looked at the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel, we made the point that discipleship was a matter of following Jesus, and that following Jesus involved several things, including being part of the community of the kingdom that Jesus was forming. And that is what then led us to talk about the Beatitudes themselves as the characteristics of the new community of exiles who are willing to return from exile in their sin into the kingdom righteousness of God. Related to that, our second part of that discussion then is going to focus on Matthew chapter 17, verse 24, through chapter 20, verse 28. And this section is a collection of pericope that have the theme of littleness in the Father's kingdom. And so what we're talking about now is a Matthean theology, if you will, of discipleship in these chapters.
In Matthew's Gospel, the disciples are not in training to become leaders. They're in training to become disciples. And Matthew's unique contribution to discipleship is that it is not a matter of position or authority or office or ordination or leadership or even servant leadership. It's a matter of becoming little in order to serve. And such discipleship is characteristic of the kingdom. Remember the Beatitudes that call for those who want to be disciples to be not only pure in heart, but also to be meek. And so the opposite attitude of some kind of self-righteousness or authority is in view for disciples. In fact, the example for the disciples is Jesus' death on a cross. We can use the word cruciform for this. Discipleship is cruciform. The way of the cross is the way of the Son of Man, who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, as the final verse of our section says in Matthew 10:28. And so we could have a little contrast in the kinds of words we use around this subject, if we like using this table. Instead of leadership, we have littleness. Instead of power, we have service. Instead of authority and operating out of a position of authority, we have responsibility. Instead of holding an office, we have fulfilling a role. Instead of control, we have oversight. Instead of haughtiness, we have humility.
So my thesis is that Jesus' teaching an example of littleness instead of leadership in Matthew was not a qualification of the leadership notion, such as our common oxymoron today, servant leadership. We hear that so often in Christian circles. But servant leadership implies the exercise of power for service. This is not the message of the cross, which is about serving in weakness. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus posed an all-out challenge to thinking in leadership terms at all. At its heart, this challenge is to the authority structures, balancing and manipulation of power resources, seeking advancement, appealing to a magisterial body apart from Jesus, and a focus on successful accomplishments. On the other hand, as we shall see, littleness must not be confused with egalitarianism, which has to do with the balancing of power in a community. One way to see what Matthew is up to is to compare him to Mark. Because if he's using Mark's gospel and moving stories around, eliminating stories, adding stories, then you can see his editorial purpose. Not always, but often. And in these chapters we can see Matthew's editorial purpose. in his composition. He uses some stories from Mark. He begins, as it were, with Mark, unless we take the last pericope of chapter 17 as the beginning, which is what this part of the lecture is going to do. But Mark is the one who basically sets up the theme. But Mark doesn't have a whole section that follows the theme through. And so Matthew has to do quite a bit of editing to turn a couple of Mark's stories into an actual theme on discipleship. So the following tables then will look at the synoptic parables of this section to see Matthew's compositional interests. And what we'll see then is Matthew's interest in his editing of Mark. To do this sort of thing, you need a gospel parallel. That can be used in any of these electronic Bible software programs where you can set up your own gospel parallels. Or you can purchase a fairly inexpensive English version of this, like Burton Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels, an old standard. Or a much more advanced one that would have Greek on one page and English on the other, and have a lot more information as well. There are all kinds of ways to look at gospel parallels. But you need to be able to do this, so you have to decide how you want to have something in your library or on your computer that can allow you to do this kind of comparison. And one of the things that we want to look at would be the relationship of pericope to each other, and then between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The other thing you would do is you'd look at the pericope themselves and compare the wording and see what wording has changed within the pericope. But at this point, let's just look at how the pericope follow one another. So notice here that we have Matthew in the blue column, and the assumption is that he's using Mark's gospel. So look at the column of Mark here, and you'll see that Mark has 4 pericope here, very short, very few verses in each one that do follow one another. They're in order. But Matthew only takes 2 of those on this page. So he eliminates the strange exorcist, number 130, the pericope that's numbered 130 in Throckmorton's Gospel Parallels. Well, why would he drop that? Well, it doesn't fit the theme of littleness. Notice what 129 has. It's the dispute of the disciples about greatness. Who's going to be greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus pulls a little child before them and says, whoever is humble like this little child is characteristic of the kingdom. So the strange exorcist breaks the theme. Well, then what about pericope 131? No, it's entitled here On Temptations, and that sounds like it might be a completely different theme. But the temptations are similar to what is said about being humble as a child, because what is said in these verses is that you have to take action to avoid sin. You must be careful not to cause one of these little ones to fall into sin. And you yourself need to be careful not to fall into sin. Pluck out your eye, cut off your right hand. Do what you have to do to avoid temptation is the point. So how that fits the theme, the argument is that it is saying you have to become little in your relationship to other people. Be careful how you treat other people. Don't throw your weight around, but be concerned about what you're teaching other people. And then be concerned about yourself. Don't think that you are immune from temptation, but you have to become little with respect to yourself. Then one third. Then a brief teaching on concerning salt is simply not going to fit the theme, so Matthew drops it. But then he tells us a pericope that is found in Luke's gospel, so we call it a Q story, and it's the parable of the lost sheep. Now in Luke, the parable of the lost sheep is one of three parables in Luke 15 that illustrate the joy of the Father when a sinner comes home. But in Matthew, in 18:10 through 14, the point of the story here is that the point of the parable of the lost sheep here is that you should go after a sheep that has left the fold, a sinner, as it were, someone who has sinned against you. You should go after that person. And if that's the case, then you might say, well, why should I go after that lost sheep? That lost sheep left the fold. Why should I go after a sheep that has sinned against me? Let him come and ask for forgiveness, and then I'll extend forgiveness. But no, that's not the point here. The point here is that you should go after that person. And again, this is an example of what it means to live in humility and community. And then Jesus really is interpreting the theme beyond the parable in Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20, on what steps to take on reproving one's brother. So if he doesn't listen to you, then you take two others, and then you eventually take it before the whole church. And only then is there excommunication. The whole purpose of judgment in the church is to bring about restoration. And the church takes a humble posture in reproving, rather than a powerful we shall lord it over you posture of the sinful person. Now, we've heard that message over the years, but we often misinterpret that in some of our churches as to say, well, we're just going to be tolerant of sin. That's not the point of the passage at all. The point of the passage is deal with the sin, but deal with it in a humble way. Now, before we leave this slide, what we haven't looked at is the very first pericope here, and that is the numbered 128 in Throckmorton, the temple tax. It's only found in Matthew's Gospel. And I've tacked it on at the before Mark introduces the theme in Mark 9:33 to 37. What I'm suggesting is that Matthew sees the story in Mark and says, I'm going to insert a story first, and then bring in Mark's dispute about greatness and so forth. And so the temple tax pericope is also part of this idea of what it means to become little as a disciple. What happens is the question arises, do you, Jesus, and your disciples, do you pay the temple tax? And so Jesus gets the question put to him from Peter. And Peter is wondering what kind of an answer he should give to the crowds asking about this issue. And Jesus says, well, you are one of the children of the kingdom. And do children of the king pay taxes? And the answer is no. So you aren't required to pay taxes, but so as not to cause offense. And then Jesus has Peter go and find a coin in a fish's mouth. And the coin, that is a coin that could pay the temple tax for two people. And so it's a tax then that is paid for Jesus and Peter. The point here then is that discipleship does carry privilege. You are in the kingdom. You are children of the kingdom. And so you have rights, but you forego your rights because discipleship also means humility, humbling yourselves before others, so as not to cause offense. So these, you see by the way in which Matthew has added a story by the way he has used some stories from Mark, and by the way he has eliminated some stories from Mark, and by the way in which he places and tells the story of the lost sheep from Q, that he is forming a theme in his gospel at this point. We can continue to see what he's doing on the next few slides as we continue to follow this pattern of the use of Mark and the use of Q and the addition of stories that are unique to Matthew. So what we have further in chapter 18 are the pericope on reconciliation and the parable of the unmerciful servant. So reconciliation continues that theme of judgment in the community. And then Peter comes and says, well, how merciful should we be? Again, if humility in the kingdom and littleness in the kingdom is about showing forgiveness, then the question is, how forgiving should we be? Should I forgive someone up to 7 times, Peter asks. And Jesus says, no, 77 times, or 70 times 7. And notice both of these pericope are not found in Mark. And Matthew is continuing to shape the theme. Now, most commentators, take chapter 18 as one of the great discourses, perhaps the great 5 discourses of Matthew's gospel. And they stop it there. And one of the reasons for doing so is that now, after doing quite a bit of reshaping of Mark's gospel, Matthew picks up with Mark's gospel and just continues. Chapter 10, 1 to 12, chapter 10, 13 to 16, chapter 10, 17 to 31, and so forth. So they don't pay attention to the fact that the theme is still present, even though the source is picked up, the source of Mark is picked up in Matthew's gospel. A second reason is that chapter 18 is really Jesus teaching. There's not much dialogue, whereas in chapter 19 you have a bit more dialogue taking place. But my point would be that that has nothing to do with how Matthew is shaping themes in his collecting of pericope. Whether it's discourse or whether it's narrative, whether it's dialogue, is not the issue. It's rather the issue is, are these pericope collected by themes? So then when we come to pericope 187 in Throckmorton, and the topic is marriage and divorce, we think that we might have a completely different topic. It has nothing to do with being little, does it? Well, it does actually, because first of all, Matthew has already given Jesus' teaching in chapter 5 on divorce and adultery or sexual immorality. And so why would he repeat it here? Just because it's in Mark's gospel? Well, it's not impossible. The story of the demoniac who was mute and delivered by Jesus in chapter 9, and then a very similar story of a blind and mute demoniac in chapter 12 suggests that possibly the same story is told. And it's told once because of Matthew's grouping in chapters 8 and 9 of miracle stories of Jesus. It's told a second time in chapter 12 because at that point Matthew is following Mark. So is this the case with marriage and divorce? That now Matthew is following Mark, and so he simply has this story here. Well, as you look at the comparison of what you find in the story of what Jesus says about marriage and divorce in chapter 19 to Mark 10, you discover that the last 3 verses in Matthew are not found in Mark. So what Jesus does is he restates the issue of marriage and divorce, but then draws a certain teaching out of that is not found in Mark. And what is that teaching? Well, it's when the disciples say, Well, if the situation is that dire with respect to marriage and divorce, then it's better not to marry. And Jesus uses that as an opportunity to say that there are different reasons why people don't marry. And then he gives three reasons, and his third reason is the point. The third reason is the kingdom of heaven may lead some people not to marry. Now, we can think immediately in context that the disciples would have thought about Jesus. Peter was married. We don't know of any of the disciples who weren't married. And so they may well have been married. Later on in the chapter, Peter says, we've left our homes and our families and followed you. But Jesus is one who is not married. And so he would stand as the great example of one for the kingdom of heaven for them who has remained single. And that then becomes the point, because in that kind of a society, marrying was all about what you did to take your proper place in society. An unmarried male was just an anomaly. The expectation was that the men would marry. You would find women who weren't married, especially widows. Men seemed to marry later than the women did, and women perhaps lived longer back then as they do today. And so many women ended up as widows at the end of their life. So there were unmarried women around. But for a young man like Jesus, and for a man in his 30s like Jesus, not to have married was it was certainly unusual. Jesus' point is that even in our marrying society, some people have become little with respect to marriage and authority in the community because of the kingdom of God. Then we have the story of Jesus blessing the children, which is very similar to Jesus pulling a child forward as an example of the humility required to enter the kingdom of heaven earlier in the beginning of chapter 18 of Matthew. And so it fits perfectly the theme. Next, we have the story of the rich man. And here too, Matthew's following Mark, but it's a perfect example of a story of someone who is going to be required in discipleship to go beyond the Ten Commandments and to give up what is near and dear to him. And in this case, it is wealth, in order to become a disciple of Jesus. That's where Peter says, look what we've given up. And Jesus says, you will receive your reward. Unique to Matthew's gospel is the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Now, they are day laborers, so that means they don't have a steady job. And so the fact that they get to work that day is grace. They are hired for work that day. That means they're going to eat at the end of the day. And so what the parable says is that these laborers are hired at different times of the day, so that at the end of the day, those hired first think that they'll be paid more. And when the time for payment comes, those who are hired last are first given their pay for the day, so that those who are hired first think, oh, we're going to get not only that, but something else. And then they end up all getting the same. And the point of the parable is that this is what the economy of the kingdom is like. It is not based on reward for work, but it is all about grace. You have been graciously hired. You were given what was you were told you would be given, and so it's a completely different economy. In an economy of grace, the grace of the kingdom, what we have is a very different understanding of status. It is not that certain people are ahead of other people but rather it leads you to think in terms of littleness in the kingdom, that we are all day laborers. We are all hoping to be able to eat at the end of the day. We are not expecting to be paid according to our own labors, but rather out of the grace of the one who has hired us to work in his kingdom. So it's a different way of thinking. It's a whole different logic that the kingdom has. And that is related to this idea of being little. We're all little. We're all in the same position. There's no one who's higher than another person. No one who's hired at the beginning of the day who receives more. And then we have the third prediction of the Passion in pericope number 191 in Throckmorton, in chapter 20, verses 17 through 19 of Matthew. Now, if there's anything that would make me want to restructure the pericope that I put together here in this section around this theme of littleness in the kingdom in Matthew's Gospel, it's the fact that this is the third prediction of the Passion. Just before the very first pericope that I chose, the pericope of the temple tax and the coin in the fish's mouth, in Matthew 17:24 and following, there was the second prediction of the Passion. So maybe we should have included that. And just before that, we have the deliverance of the epileptic boy after the transfiguration in chapter 17. And just before that, in chapter 16, we have Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah in the regions of Caesarea Philippi. After which Jesus then says, "And now let me tell you that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, suffer and die, and on the third day be raised from the dead." And that is the first prediction of the Passion. So maybe our whole section should begin way back in chapter 16 with the first prediction of the Passion. What keeps me from doing that is that it's difficult to include the transfiguration story in this theme. And so I think rather what's happening with Matthew is he's following the predictions of the Passion that Mark has. In Mark 8 and following, he gives the first one, the second one, the third one, just like Mark does. But that's not the way in which Matthew is actually structuring his gospel here. He just includes those predictions of the Passion. Instead, he forms another section that has this theme of littleness in the kingdom. But certainly the Passion predictions indicate the kind of littleness that the disciples are to have as disciples. If this is the way that the Son of Man, who is given authority from the Ancient of Days in heaven, is going to behave, how much more his disciples should behave in ways that follow a path of the cross rather than the path of glory and power. And so then we come to the final pericope in our section. It's the story of the sons of Zebedee and Jesus. And the question is asked, could we sit on either side of you in the kingdom? Could we have positions of power with you in the kingdom? And Jesus basically deflects that question and points to what's really going on in their hearts. And what they're doing is they're seeking positions of power. They have not yet understood that the little child is the example of the one in the kingdom, not the person who is seated at seats of authority and honor in the kingdom. And then Jesus gives himself as an example. He says, it's not to be, you're not to behave the way the world does, where you want to, where the goal is to lord it over other people. But rather, take me as an example. The Son of Man did not to come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Matthew 20, verse 28. And so there the there the whole section of Matthew 17:24 to chapter 20, verse 28, has the theme of what it means to be little in the kingdom of heaven. What we have then is a section that is similar to other parts of the Gospel of Matthew. The characteristics of discipleship mentioned in the Beatitudes, and and also the example of Jesus for his disciples as the one who goes to the cross. And so in Matthew's Gospel, we have this radically different understanding of discipleship from the scribes and Pharisees, who like to seek places of honor and be called rabbi and teacher and father. But quite the opposite with the disciples of the kingdom. They recognize that humility and littleness is characteristic of the kingdom of heaven. And all of that is related to the underlying narrative of the return of Israel from exile, because they don't receive the kingdom as righteous people sitting around the temple waiting for God to come and bless them and help them because they're so good, but rather they are people who are still along the waters of Babylon weeping, as the psalm says, and broken in their hearts, and meek and mourning and hungering and thirsting after righteousness. They are the little ones who are being gathered by God graciously and brought out of captivity in their sins and into the reign of God. What I've been suggesting is that in this section of Matthew 17:24 to 20:28, Matthew has written a section in his gospel that deals with discipleship, but not just discipleship, but specifically discipleship as littleness. And so the next part of this lecture is going to look quickly, using some further tables, at the vocabulary of discipleship in the section we've just covered. The Greek words will be written in italics here in the blue column and translated in the parentheses. So notice in the left column that we're going to proceed through the different pericope in this section from 17:24 through 27. And there we find the word son, huios. The next pericope we find the word paidion, or child. And then we find the word little, mikros, in 18:6 through 7. We're going to ignore the right column here. Some comments are given there that repeat to some extent what we've gone over earlier, but could be used if you want to pause the lecture at any point to give some further thought to Matthew's redaction of Mark.
In the next two verses, in Matthew 18:8 through 9,
nothing on
there's
little
no
or
particular
child or
word
anything
that
related.
indicates littleness.
But then mikros appears again in
Here
verse
Jesus
10.
talks about
And
removing
then,
the hand, the foot, or the
verse
eye that causes
11
one to stumble.
is actually not part of the
that one should
original
cut it off.
text
And this
in
hyperbole,
Matthew's Gospel, so
though,
we'll skip that.
does suggest becoming less by removing what causes sin. And so there is a sense of littleness as well. And in the next verse, Matthew 18, verse 10, Jesus says, "Do not despise one of these little ones." And here the word mikros is used. The next verse in some English translations, Matthew 18:11, is actually not found in the better manuscripts, and it's a later addition, so we skip that.
And then we have mikros again in verses 12 through 14 about the parable of the lost sheep. The word brother appears in 15 through 17, which gives a sense of equality within the community of Christ. not someone who is higher or lower than you. Just to pause on that for a second, Matthew 18, verse 15, at times has been used in an abusive way, I think, where people will say, if you have something against your brother, you need to go and tell him first. And then the person who says that is actually a person in authority. So they're setting up a system where any complaints have to come to them first. And it puts the person who goes to them in the person who goes to them is already in a position of littleness and is not a person who is becoming little to go to the person who has sinned. And that is actually a potentially abusive relationship, and often is, where a person in authority sets up a system that privileges them even further with information about any disgruntledness in the institution, the church or the theological college or whatever we're looking at in this case. So the word brother, I think, is an equalizing term in 18, 15 through 17. Then we have the word doulos, servant or slave. Adelphos, again, brother. As we move into chapter 19, we actually have the whole pericope is 1 through 12, but we don't have the language of littleness here. However, in what Matthew adds to the pericope about divorce and remarriage is the word eunuch, verses 10 through 12. Some have become eunuchs for the kingdom, and obviously that's a term of littleness in a community that values marriage. Then again we have paideon, Jesus receiving the little children. In Matthew 19, 16 through 22, the rich young man is uniquely called a young man in Matthew's gospel. And whether this has any significance or not is very difficult to say. One thing we can say is that the rich young man has a problem because rich people cannot become small enough to pass through the eye of a needle. And whether a young man has the connotation that here is someone who is a bit little, who has followed the 10 Commandments, but isn't little enough because of his wealth, is perhaps a bit of a stretch. But still, the idea of wealth making one too big to pass through the eye of a needle is part of the idea of Matthew 19:16 through 22. The last, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. So the last are privileged in Matthew 19:23 to 30. And in 21 through 16, again, we have the same thing, the last. Jesus' prediction of his own death fits the theme, but there's no language there that captures that. However, in chapter 20, 20 through 28, the final pericope of our section, we have terms like diakonos, servant, and doulos, slave or servant, over against those who want to be megas, or great. Now, the language of discipleship elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel captures this same kind of diversity and the same perspective on being little. This isn't unique to Matthew's Gospel. One can find similar things in John's Gospel, for example, but it's just more to the argument that discipleship is characterized by littleness in Matthew's Gospel. And once again, we won't read through all these passages, but we will note several verses that capture this language of littleness. Mikros, again, or little. Nepios, which is sometimes translated as babes. Here in the ESV it's translated as little children and infants. Teknon, which means child. Pais, which means servant or child. Huios, which is the normal word for son. And sometimes that's used of Jesus, of course, as the Son or the Son of God or even the Son of Man. That language is present. But it's also used of disciples, where the disciples are called sons and God is called Father. Elakistos is the Greek word for least. And rather significantly in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." And he's referring then to his disciples, to the least of these, my brethren. And diakonos means servant, or diakoneo is the verb to serve. That language is found again in Matthew. Doulos, servant, doulo, to serve. Several times in Matthew's Gospel. Mathetes means disciple, and obviously this too is a term of littleness because they're not teachers, they're not rabbis, they're not to be called father, but they are disciples. Now the theology of discipleship in Matthew's Gospel is something that we've been building towards by looking at the structuring that Matthew does in forming a theme in 17:24 to 20:28 of discipleship as littleness, in the vocabulary that we found within that section, and the vocabulary that we find elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel. So let's look at this a bit further. In this and the next slide, we'll quickly summarize what we've seen in this section. Matthew 17:24, the disciples forego their rights as children of the king, so as not to cause offense. Matthew 18:1 through 3, the discipleship is seen to be humility, like a little child. In 18:4 through 10, the importance of being little is the point that is being made. That is, not causing other little ones to stumble, or even oneself. Matthew 18:12 through 20 has to do with the subject of littleness and restoring the sinner. And here we have the parable of the lost sheep, and then also steps to be taken for restoration up until the very last moment. And then finally the person is ostracized from the community if nothing else can be done. Matthew 18:21 through 35, endless forgiveness. Peter asks, how many times should I forgive? Up to 7 times? Jesus answers, no, 70 times 7. Matthew 19:1 through 12. Jesus expands on what he says about marriage and divorce to make the point that some have given up marriage for the sake of the kingdom. Matthew 19:13 through 15. Jesus makes the point that the kingdom belongs to little children. Matthew 19:16 through 30. Giving up wealth for the kingdom. Matthew 20:1 through 16. The last will be first is the point of the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Matthew 20:17 through 19 is Jesus' third prediction of the Son of Man's passion. And then Matthew 20:20 through 28. Those wishing to be great must serve as the Son of Man has come to serve. In conclusion, then, let's just note some issues that apply to life today. In front of the text issues, interpreting littleness for discipleship and ministry. Firstly, Jesus is the paradigm for littleness. Secondly, the kingdom mission is characterized by littleness. Thirdly, littleness is the key to our relationship with God our Father. Fourth, littleness is the key to our relationship with one another. Fifth, Littleness is the path of losing one's life in order to find it, and being first by being last. So discipleship is a matter of taking up a cross and losing one's life. As we read in Matthew 10:38 through 39, when Jesus is telling his disciples about the character of the mission that they are to go on, we read, "And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Finally then, in Matthew's Gospel, we find a direct challenge to the very notion of ministry as leadership. And many have recognized this generally about Christian teaching and have tried to correct it with the language of servant leadership. The problem with this is that every despot understands himself or herself as a servant leader. Look at what I'm doing for the nation. Look at what I'm doing for the church. I'm giving myself, my time, my energy. I'm giving people gifts, as it were. Some actually do give physical gifts. Look at all the things. Look at all the good that I'm doing. And what's happened is the person has set himself or herself up in a position of power, able to distribute gifts to other people, and understands the exercise of power in a way that makes him or herself seem as if they're just wonderful, good people. The challenge that the cross gives to such notions of leadership is a challenge that is directly related not only to Jesus' ministry, but also to the paradigm of the cross itself. Jesus shows us that giving up power is the way of Jesus Christ, is the way of the cross. And in this, then, they are called to pick up their crosses and follow him. They are to become little, giving up power, giving up the desire for power. And in so doing, they discover ways to serve. Matthew 17:24 to 20:28 gives us a number of ways in which this can happen with respect to how one deals with sin in one's own life or sin in the community, with respect to issues like marriage, with respect to issues like rights, to go back to the very first pericope on paying the temple tax, just giving up your own rights, humility like a child, and also with giving up wealth and not seeking to get more than the rest because you feel like you've worked longer in the vineyard, and not seeking positions of honor like the sons of Zebedee, but rather seeking ways in which to serve. That's the key. It's not servant leadership, but it's service itself. That seems to be the challenge that Matthew offers to so many of our views of ministry today. We're not about how we can become Christian professionals, but rather how we can serve. The old language that we used to use was the language of ministry, and we've replaced it since about the mid-1980s with the language of leadership. What a mistake that's been for the church.